presentation on art restitution. So our overarching question was, do the limitations of art restitution outweigh the moral benefits? Our answer was no. Given specific criteria, art restitution is necessary. We'll discuss that criteria in our presentation. Now I'm going to go to Ryan to discuss a quick background on art restitution.
So the basic definition of art restitution is simply restoring art to the rightful owner. And in analyzing this issue, there's two contrasting perspectives. One is a morality theory known as deontology, in which restituting art is important and an obligation regardless of any inconvenience that it causes. And then the other one is utilitarianism, which takes a more practical approach and views art restitution as only necessary if it benefits the greatest number of people. And so we analyze art restitution through a few different perspectives, including Western versus non-Western, cultural, legal, and economic. So I'll be going over Western versus non-Western. So as I mentioned earlier, the utilitarian perspective is the one that's adopted by Western countries because they believe that
Keep going. Marissa, just a little bit over. There you go. Thanks. Go.
Okay. Because they believe that housing works of art and displaying them in the museums is important to increase the knowledge of their citizens, to foster pluralism and tolerance towards the various cultures around the world, which is something that's particularly lacking in the status quo. And on the other hand, non-Western nations, where much of the art originates, believe that the art should be restituted back to them regardless of any circumstance because they rightfully own it. So the problem is, which Jill Chenen, who is a Northwestern graduate and director for the American Bar Association, she talks about how non-Western nations have been primarily involved with violence and civil unrest, and that's one main fear of Western countries because if there's important works of art there, then they could possibly pose a danger or a risk to the safety. And since the preservation of art is paramount to both Western and non-Western countries, they think that this is a significant problem. And so a good example of this is the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. So Dr. Melody Broderi, who's the editor for the American Council for Southern Asian Art, talks about how the Bamiyan Buddhas were one of the world's most renowned works of art. They're inside of a cliff within Afghanistan, and they're carved into it, and they're huge statues. But unfortunately, in 2001, they were actually bombed and destroyed by the Taliban, as you can see in the right half of the image. And this was because they were protesting the lack of humanitarian aid in a primarily poor region. And so this represents the escalation of political instability in a non-Western country, which inevitably resulted in the destruction of historic art. So that's a pretty compelling example of what Western countries fear. And then Julia will now discuss the cultural perspective.
So the cultural non-Western perspective focuses on African art, and African art has been used to invoke rain and bring good harvest, but it's been destroyed and lost due to war and thievery, according to Ladislas Seji, author of over 4 works on African art. Right now, the Benin bronzes of Nigeria are gone. They've been stolen during a punitive expedition during 1897 by the British, and they're currently in Germany, Austria, and the US. Britain's willing to loan back the works, but they're not willing to permanently return them, according to Nick Squires of The Telegraph. However, the President of France is currently working to return the works permanently back to the African people as of March 2018, according to Annalisa Quinn of the New York Times. So hopefully restitution is in sight. However, some people do not want their works back. The people of New Ireland and Papua New Guinea, for example, don't want their Mulligan back, which is used during mortuary ceremonies. They don't want it back because they just leave it to decompose, and it's not very important to their culture, according to Suzanne Kuchla of the University of College in London. However, for most, restitution is important, so numerous legal strategies have been used in order to restitute art, which will be further explained by Ethan.
So the painting you see on your right is the Delbosch Flower 1, which is one of the most important paintings in art restitution history, as it was stolen by Nazis during World War II. It eventually ended up in an Austrian art gallery. And then Maria Altmann, the predecessor of her uncle, decided to sue Austria in order to get the art back, resulting in the court case Altmann versus Austria, which is one of the most important cases in art restitution history. As the United States Supreme Court, according to Elizabeth Handy of the Cambridge University Press, decided that the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, or the FSIA, applies retroactively, meaning it applies to pre-1952 events, meaning that the art that was stolen during World War II can be restituted back. And since that was decided, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of the United States expanded and was influenced several other laws in other countries, and even influenced a UNESCO directive that was the definitive directive in our institution. I'll now talk about Marissa and the economics of that.
So since art restitution is such a complicated process, we have to evaluate the economic perspective in two different ways. The first way is how art is defined, and the second way is the exchange of art, or the flow of art. So according to Gunther Schultz, art is defined two ways. The first is reproducible art, and the second is unique non-reproducible art. And reproducible art is mass-produced art or specific pieces of art like artifacts or paintings, while unique art is more specific to a culture, and it can also be intellectual knowledge or art. And so there are two distinct exchanges between the flow of art. The first one is between consumers and companies and consumers, so that would be like groups of artists and individual owners. And the second is between consumers and collectors, so groups of artists or owners and collectors like museums. And a lot of times these collectors form alliances, and one of those major ones on the right of the screen is called SINOA, and it's basically the International Confederation of Art, and it deals with traders and antique dealers. So considering all of these perspectives we talked about, which includes non-Western, Western, cultural, economic, and legal, we have to consider a case-by-case approach to restituting art. So in this case-by-case approach, the major objective between Western and non-Western claims is the disagreement between the safety of art. So our first step is evaluating the safety of art and by an international committee, and it would be an unbiased one, and basically they evaluate the risk of art if it's returned to its Western country. And the second step would be if there is a threat that poses to the piece of art, then the non-Western country can house the piece of art. And the third step would be once the original country becomes qualified to own the art again, the Western country can take it back. And so the additional benefit to this would be while the non-Western country deals with all the internal political issues, then the Western country can go ahead and house the piece in the meanwhile. So Kate will now discuss the limitations to our solution.
So, analyzing every single case of art restitution can be time-consuming and very costly. So it's not really practical. There could be an overall precedent set by repatriation laws. However, Mitchell McInes, a law professor at the University of Alberta, asserts that these laws could be too broad or too vague, which could lead to additional conflict within the countries. Another problem would be that it's not easy for the group to evaluate there's a lot of room for interpretation when evaluating if a country is fit for their art piece back. Of course there is obvious ones like war or rebellion or natural disaster. However, there's still a lot of room for interpretation. If there's a qualified and unbiased group of people on the international committee, though, there's less likelihood for mistakes.
And so, given all these perspectives, like the limitations that Kate just shared, we have some qualifications as to why the case-by-case approach can still be good overall. And so that was our interpretation of art restitution.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and start with Kate. Describe how the content of the team presentation was changed as a result of the group discussion.
Well, it actually changed a lot. We started by, in terms of just the presentation, we had all of our own specific lenses in the presentation. I had a futuristic lens. Marissa had non-Western cultural and so on and so forth. But throughout conversation and just going over our slides and practicing the presentation and stuff, we decided to focus more on our case-by-case approach and the limitations rather than the specific lenses, and that was our biggest fluctuation between our presentation.
And thank you. And Ryan, how did the group decide to include Marissa's perspective or lens or conclusions into the overall presentation?
Okay, so hers was actually one of the last to be added in because we kind of forgot to think about the economy, so we were a little caught up in the non-Western versus Western and cultural and legal, but we realized that in order to understand art restitution, it's also important to analyze how art itself travels, who is the producer and consumer, and the monetary value of a certain work of art determines how important it is to certain countries. So once we realized that, since Marissa wrote that in her own research paper, I think she kind of conveyed the importance of it, and we were able to add it in within our presentation.
Good. Thank you, Ryan. And Julia, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Ryan's findings.
Ryan's findings were the Western perspective, so they kind of showed the very reason as to why restitution is sometimes hard. So the utilitarianism kind of viewpoint that the West has kind of showed me why they might want to take the art from the non-Western cultures. They want art to be seen by everybody, as many people as possible. And so whenever like it's in a country that's war-torn or whenever it's just dangerous situations, they'll be willing to take that art. And it kind of made me consider why there might be an issue with people not getting their art back, because the West, not only would they be worried that it's a dangerous place, but they just want as many people to be able to see the art as possible. So therefore, art might not be restituted.
Great. Thank you. And Marissa, reflecting on your team's work, which one had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem of art restitution?
I feel that the legal perspective had a big impact on art restitution because it provided the basis of cases so far in art restitution and the major ones that like shaped how Western versus non-Western countries could restitute art. And also it helped me form my economic perspective on the trade of art within legal, like past legal cases.
Good. And Ethan, in what way did you improve your ability to work with within a group as a result of this project?
So like a lot of like what I did was ended up not getting an input